we're going to pick up on our restart timer function. And for this one, we're going to start off again with this regex. So we're going to have, let's see, we're going to do an extract the integer value from ID of the clock div. So that is going to look like this. We're going to have clock restarted ID equals ID string dot replace. So for this regex, and I'm going to explain this here because I didn't explain what exactly all is going on with this. Okay, so we have the regex in between the two forward slashes. We have the G, which is global, so do a search across the entire string. Caret is start of the input string. We have the D here, which is for digits. So we're looking for digits across the entire string, basically is how it's going to work. And because we have some identifier like clock underscore, then we have a digit because we dropped that ID in there. Going back over here. So this ID here, that's always going to be a digit. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so then we get into a conditional, and this is going to be check if the current clock is running and whose timer is going to be reset. Let's see, we want running. Okay, so for that, we're going to say if the current running clock and is equal to clock restarted ID. So whatever number that ID is going to be. If that is the case, then we are working with the clock we think we're working with. I'm going to say here if clock array. And for that, we're going to have clock restarted ID. So we're going to do some state change set here. This is actually if it's equal to false, so we're building a conditional. And in here is where we're setting the inner HTML. So when we want to tell them the clock is running, we want to set the is started to true. And then we want to set the current running clock to the clock restarted ID. So that is going to be clock array. And we're going to do clock restarted ID. Then the message ID.innerHTML. And for this, we're just going to say clock is running. So we have another state here that we want to set. That's the is started. I'm going to copy this right here. And do an is started equals true. So for this one, we're going to do our clear interval, this next one. So this is going to be clear interval. And we're going to pass in clock array with our current running clock and count down ID. So we have to keep track of what the current running clock is, and that now is this one here. And then we'll have our countdown ID, so which we did the clear interval on earlier. We're going to do our set interval this time. So we have a clock array. We're going to do clock restarted. That's going to be countdown ID. And we have set interval. And we're passing in the first parameter is a string. So counter clock restarted ID with 1000. And that completes this first conditional. So what we have here with this else, these are the ones where we're just going to do an alert. And we're going to say, let's see, this clock is already running. And something similar we're going to do outside of the else. So let's see here. And we're going to say in this one, the clock is not running. So the clock is not running. So that will complete our restart timer. And what we're going to do now is get back into our long break and our sharp break. So before we go back up to what we were doing there, because we have created functions like this, we're not creating the same functions. These here were really manipulations with the view. what we're doing now, we're going to create functions to do internal state storage and change. So the first one, we're going to go with long break. So before we had count and long break, we're just doing long break now. And we're going to parse again. And let's see here, we're going to have the same string. So we're going to have this again. And now we know what this is doing. And this one we're going to call long break ID. So clock restarted, long break ID. So we get our ID, and that's the first part we do with these particular kinds of functions. And then we're going to go with our array. We're going to do our clock long break ID, and is started is going to be false. So then we have that conditional where we're doing clock long break ID. Is it equal to the current running clock? And inside of the conditional, we're going to set the inner HTML to long break, and we're also going to set our long break short break times. So we want to do our array, clock array, and pass in clock long break and our message ID. So we'll have inner HTML and do long break. This right here I'm going to copy because we're going to have 3 more just like it. Okay, so here we're going to set long break value, which is 600. We'll set short break as well, which is going to be 300. And now we're going to clear interval. For that, we're going to do our array. We're going to have current running clock, and then the countdown ID. And then we also have our countdown ID here that we're getting out of our set interval. So we're going to have our clock array, which is going to be our clock long break. That didn't work. Clock long break. Countdown ID, and equal to the set interval. So we pass in counter long break, clock long break ID, and want to pass in 1000. Save that. Then we're going to do an else on this with an alert. This clock is not running. All right. So that completes this one. We're going to create our sharp break now. By the way, I don't think I've explained this one here, set interval. So if you'll look for set interval, there's no definition in here because it is a JavaScript function. And what it's doing is taking a function. So we're passing the string in, and the string is going to get evaluated. So what it's going to do is it's going to take this ID we have here, so from here, and pass it into our counter long break, so that it can then go to the corresponding long break function that is working with the UI based on the interval that we've set here. So it's clicking off and evaluating periodically is what it's doing. All right. And so what we're going to do now is really a very similar kind of function. And I'm going to copy this, in fact, and just paste and do some changes. Again, have to be very careful when doing these kinds of things. So this right here, the clock is not running. That is valid. We're going to change some of these. So the regex is certainly still valid. We're going to do this and change the IDs. And so here we're looking for this one. Current running clock is good. So these indexers are all getting changed. We want short break, and these are okay. Normally we would have short before long. It doesn't matter. They're both getting assigned correctly, the correct values. And then we have current running clock in our clear interval. And this here, again, another JavaScript function, basically clears the interval set by set interval. So we are making sure there's nothing. Here's one. Actually, where was I? Right here. This is short. And I think that will cover everything we're looking for. So this right here needs to be our ID, so short break ID, and that should work. What I can do here is do long. So that was helpful. See, counter short break. Or actually, yeah, that seems like it should be clock. Okay, so counter short break, then clock short break. Okay, so that's what we want. Counter long break, clock long break. So that is all we need to do there on the long break and the short break for the state changes. So all the values for those different breaks are going to be kept now by those functions. We've got our reset timer, or actually our restart timer. There's a reset timer coming. So we have a stop timer, we have a reset timer. We're going to get into those in the next lesson. We also have where we need to build a function for our audio to make sure our audio plays. So those are coming up in the next lesson. We're going to now build our stop timer function, and then we're going to go into our reset timer function. So here we're going to have our stop, not start, but stop timer. We're going to do an ID string, and we're going to have the parsing. So I'm going to copy this and paste here. I'm going to call this just clock ID, like that. Okay, so now we have our conditionals. We're going to do if clock ID equals current running clock. Okay, so now we're going to stop everything. So basically get a reset on display. So we're going to have clock array, and we can drop in clock ID for the index. We want to access our minutes. This is going to be inner HTML. We're going to set those to 25. And we're going to go back with our array, same index, on seconds. We're going to set those to 0. And now we're going to clear interval. This is going to happen on our countdown ID. So we have our clock array, our clock ID, our countdown ID. Then we're going to set our big time, so clock array. We want that to 14.99. And this is going to be 25 minutes. Okay, so now we're going to, since this is reset, we're going to go back to our -1 so that we know there's not really a clock going on right now. And we'll have an else on that as well. So in else, we're just going to do clock ID equals, and that's going to be current running clock. And then alert, this clock is not running. So that is stop timer. Now we're going to reset timer. So reset timer. And we're going to take in another ID string, so the ID that we're parsing out, and we can do this. Actually, we can do this. Okay. And I'm just going to call this clock reset ID. And close the brace there. So inside of the body of this, actually for the reset, we're not even looking for this. We don't need it. We get the ID and then we can just start on it. Okay, so we're going to have our clock array. I'm going to take this. So this is going to be on our big time, our minutes, and our seconds also. So we'll just do big time first, which is going back to 14.99. And then we're going to do our minutes and seconds. Same index. So we'll have our minutes. This is the inner HTML. And like above, we have 25. And then we're going to have 0 for seconds. Inner HTML is going to be 00. Okay, so at this point, we want to check if clock is running is greater than 0. And in that case, we're going to do our clear interval on countdown timer. So current running clock greater than 0, clear interval. And for that, we have clock array, current running clock, and then our countdown ID. And outside of that conditional, we'll do our current running clock is -1. Save. So with those finished, we have some smaller functions. So we want to hide clock. We've got shade color. We're going to do that. We have our play sound and our wait. So let's do hide clock first. We're going to have another ID string. And for this here, we're going to do close ID. So hide is the same as a close. This is going to be clock underscore plus. And we'll have ID string replace. We're going to go ahead and use this same regex. I noticed that I am not doing the replace. This is actually replace. So I need this here. And yeah, so all of these need that. This is a replace. It needs a second parameter. And I am not putting it in there. All right, so let's see if there's another. This one has it. Okay, so I'm going to copy this one. I'm using it down here inside of our hide clock. There we go. So building back up the clock underscore with the matching ID in this case is what we're doing. And we're going to have ID string replace. And that's all we need there. This actually could probably have just gone into a variable and then reference the variable in the 2 instead of just repeating that code like that. So what I'll have here is current running clock. And I want to check if it is close clock ID. Let's see, close clock ID. Okay, so in that case, we'll do our current running clock goes back to -1. And then outside of this conditional, we're going to get our close ID and set the style to none. So document get element by ID, close ID, and let's see, make sure that is a lower I. I probably meant to do that as an upper I, but that's okay because they're matching, they're consistent here. So we're going to say style display and hide. That is a none, not a navigation. There we go. That is all we need for hide clock. And let's see here. So what I want to do now is we can do our sound. So play sound. This is not a big one at all. We're going to have a variable for sound, and we're going to get the audio element. So document get element by ID is going to be audio. So all we have to do is call the play sound or the sound.play, and we're done with that one. So that should complete the functions that we have in our code behind. And the next big thing is just to see what will happen with behavior of the application. So I'm going to bring up our integrated terminal. We're going to do an npm start. We have our dev tools available so that we can see what's happening. So we want to select, we're going to do one, it's going to submit. All right, so yeah, so the submit is not doing anything. So there's some issues with that part that we're going to have to trace down. And I'm going to go into our index. So this is likely where we're going to start looking. I'm going to go ahead and stop this segment here because we've actually finished up our coding. And right now we're going to have a little bit of debugging to do because that's going to take a little bit of time. We're going to go ahead and get into the next segment, and we're going to go through and see what exactly is causing our submit not to work, and then make sure we got all the functionality that we want, and that should complete our Pomodoro clock. All right, so we left off with our site not having any functionality. The UI is there, but when we click submit, we're not getting any kind of feedback. So one thing that is going on here is we're actually missing a div. And this div is actually going to close off right here. So that will close off this combo area because we have this ID combo, which is really just for this right here. All right, so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and restart this. So we have our dev tools, there's no errors, we can submit, and then we have our clock. And we can add another clock, so that is looking good. Now there's a few other small changes I made on the back, just kind of in full disclosure of what's going on in our JS file. These were minor, these were things like where the conditional equality was a single equal rather than two. So some minor things like that. I don't want to go through everything we did there to not waste any kind of time on it because you're going to get the code. So you'll have the working code whenever you download it. So that was the adjustment we need to make. Now we can go ahead and start this clock, for example. It's going to start counting down. And at some point, we want to take a break. So we have our sharp break. We click it. Now we go off, got a sharp break. It's going to pop up a message or make a sound. Whenever it finishes, we come back here. We want to resume our work. So now we're back in our work state. We can, of course, go ahead and stop it. And I'm going to go ahead and start this again. We can reset. So we start back where we were. Go ahead and start. We have our long break. So 10 minutes in this case. And then at some point we come back over here. While the clock is going on, we want to resume. So we go back into our clock. Now I'm going to reset this now while it's ticking. And if we try to stop, so we get a message, the clock is not running. And here you can see we add another clock if we want. I'm going to go ahead and stop this, bring it back up. We can select how many we want. So 3, and there we go. We have 3 clocks now. Go ahead and start one of them, start our work, go do what we got to do. So again, this is focused time. That's the whole point of the Pomodoro is you get this focused time to do whatever it is you want. And at some point, maybe 15 minutes in, you say, okay, I need a break. You know, it's intense work. Then you go ahead and flip into your break. So it's all timed, it's all well structured, and the break is strict. So you're adhering to the 5-minute break, and you're not going to fall outside of that because again, you'll get the message, you'll get the the alarm that will also sound. And then you'll just come back, you'll resume work if you're finishing before your break. And then go ahead until this time runs out. And I'll go ahead and stop that. And you can see it resets to 25. I can close the clock, so that gets rid of one of them. So all that functionality is there. Now there is another thing, kind of minor, that I mentioned earlier on where we have our CSS. And if we want to go ahead and place this into a file, we can do that. So I'm going to create a file, just call this style CSS and put that in here and save that. Now over here, we just need to change up how we're doing this. So this is still going to be type is text CSS, but what we want to do is rel. So it's going to be basically relation is going to be style sheet. We're going to have our href is going to point to style CSS. I'm going to put this in quotes. Like that. And we'll close that off. There we go. Save. And this right here is no longer a style. It's actually going to be a link tag. So let's go ahead and start and make sure nothing else is broken. So just remove our dev tools. I'm going to do 2 clocks and submit. There we go. So styling is still there. Start the clock. Still functional. That works. So we are good. And that completes our Pomodoro clock application. Welcome to our course, Projects in Electron by Eduonix. I'd like to review what we've covered in this module in creating a Pomodoro clock. So our clock allowed us to focus for 25 minutes on some task, and then you had the option to take breaks as well, 5 minutes or 10-minute breaks. We went into a few stages as we were creating this. So we started off with our fundamental components, so just this scaffolding. And for something like the bootstrap.js, You can really just use the one from the Hello World, although ours, this time, we saw how there are several things you can actually remove out of the bootstrap.js, but it doesn't hurt to have them in there if you just want to drop in a default bootstrap.js, then you can do that for sure. So we saw the communication between the package.json and the bootstrap.js, and also the view, which in our case was called index.html. So the view had some dynamic code inside of it to help with generating these clocks, which can be generated dynamically and then removed dynamically as well. Now, some of the heavier lifting was on the back end inside of the index.js, where the controller lives. So we had things like starting and stopping timers, resuming timers, resetting them, and we manage all that state inside of the index.js. So that's a review of what we covered in this module and creating our Pomodoro clock.